Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really bold argument that challenges pretty much everything we think we know about religion, about science, and what it all means for the future of humanity.
So, right out of the gate, the author just throws down the gauntlet with this question. The whole argument is that before we can even begin to talk about the future of faith, we need a much, much stricter definition of what a religion actually is.
Okay, so this is where it gets really specific. Here's the author's very narrow definition of a true religion. They're arguing it's not about community, it's not about tradition. Nope. It is purely a spiritual and psychological thing, and it's focused specifically on gods or Buddhas. Now, this definition, it's the key to their entire argument.
And, once you apply that strict filter, the author comes up with some, well, pretty provocative classifications. As you can see right here, they argue that only Christianity and Buddhism really qualify as true and complete. Others, like Islam and Catholicism, are seen as being compromised by worldly stuff. Taoism, that's a social activity. And Judaism is viewed as a foundational but ultimately incomplete system.
Okay, so you'd think that would be the end of it, right? But no, the author claims that even these two so-called true religions aren't the final answer. In fact, they believe they're destined to fail. So let's dig into why the text argues that even these most complete faiths are, in the end, flawed and temporary.
And this is where the author lays out a kind of logical trap. Think about it. If God created religion, why on earth would God create two systems like Christianity and Buddhism that are so different, so contradictory? And on the other hand, if they were just made up by humans, well, then they're obviously flawed and they can't be the absolute truth. From the author's point of view, it's a checkmate. To really drive this point home for Christianity, the author shares this personal story. It really creates a catch-22, doesn't it? If the teacher says yes, it kind of supports evolution over creation. But if they say no, it contradicts the Bible's claim that Adam and Eve are the ancestors of all of us. Either way you slice it, the author argues, the scripture just doesn't seem consistent. Okay, so what about Buddhism? Well, the author turns their critique to what they call unprincipled mercy. The argument is basically that, yeah, compassion is great, but a mercy that has no limits, no principles, it can lead to some really absurd and even harmful results. And this slide, wow, it really illustrates the author's point perfectly. They create this kind of slippery slope, asking, okay, where do you draw the line? If you let a mosquito bite you out of mercy, does that same thinking apply to letting cockroaches run all over your food? Or letting weeds choke out the crops that are supposed to feed people? Or letting bacteria just fester in a wound? The point is, the author contends that real mercy has to have principles, or it just becomes foolishness. So, if all religions are flawed, according to the author, then what's left? Where are we supposed to turn? And the answer is probably not what you're expecting. It's science. The text actually reframes science not as some rival to faith, but as its most authentic, truest expression. You know that old saying, science is a double-edged sword? Well, the author says that's a dangerous fallacy. Blaming science for all of humanity's problems, pollution, weapons, you name it, is like blaming the hammer instead of the person who swings it. And to just completely take apart that idea, the author lays out this chain of logic. It's pretty compelling. Let's walk through it. So, if we blame science for how it's misused, then shouldn't we blame the parents of a criminal for having a child? And their parents before them? If you follow that logic all the way back, the text asks, do we ultimately blame God for creating the universe where the crime happened? Of course not. That's absurd. The responsibility is with the user, not the tool. And this right here, this is the absolute core of the argument. The author isn't just defending science. They're saying that to walk the path of science is to walk the path of God. I mean, if you believe God created this incredibly orderly universe that follows certain laws, then studying those laws is basically studying the mind of God. So all of this, the critique of religion, the embrace of science, it all leads to the author's grand solution. It's a vision for the future of spirituality called Wanjiao Guiyi. Now, literally, this translates to something like 10,000 religions returned to one. But hold on, because as the author makes very clear, this is not about creating some new super religion. It's something totally different. And I think this is so fascinating. The author explains this whole concept by telling us what it isn't. It's not another church. There are no priests, no new holy books. Instead, it's presented as this universal state of being, just a direct reverence for one single creator,
which frees up humanity to celebrate all human wisdom, not just one narrow doctrine.
And this is where things get really serious. The author presents this vision not as some nice idea, but as an absolute necessity for the survival of our entire civilization. The stakes just got a whole lot higher. So the argument goes like this. There's a pattern, right? Throughout history, you see it again and again. Civilizations get powerful through technology, but then they get arrogant. The second a society starts to believe that it is the ultimate power, with no higher authority to answer to, well, that's when it plants the seeds of its own destruction. And as a modern example of how to avoid this collapse, the author points to the United States. They see that phrase, "in God we trust," as the key. They argue it's the very source of America's strength, because it shows a humility, a reliance on a higher power that prevents the kind of arrogance that has brought down so many empires in the past.
But that leads to the next logical question, doesn't it? Okay, so you need a higher power, but which one? Is it enough to just believe in any gods or Buddhas? Does it matter which one a civilization chooses?
And the author's answer to that is a hard no. This is a really critical distinction for them. They argue that the gods and Buddhas we know from traditional religions, they're part of the universe, just like us. They are created, not the creator. And because of that, they just don't have the ultimate power to save civilization. For that, the author says, you have to go straight to the source, the one supreme God of everything. So, after all that, the critique of religion, the championing of science, the dire warnings about civilization, it all comes down to this. One final, incredibly provocative choice for all of humanity. And there it is. The author lays it out in the starkest possible terms. For them, humanity's choice is just that simple. Embrace the one true God or face what they call a great calamity. For them, this isn't about personal faith. It's about the survival of our entire species. So the question the author leaves us with is a pretty heavy one. Which path are we on? The one to a unified future or the one to a self-inflicted disaster?